Well, it's certainly bright enough.
They can see us.
We just can't see them.
It's true.
Right. Mayor, welcome to Philadelphia.
Thank you.
City of brotherly love and sisterly affection. Tell us a little bit about Evanston, population, a little bit of your history. I mean, I know, everybody has the Google machine and everything, but, it's nothing like hearing it from you.
Yeah, fair enough. So I'm the mayor of Evanston, Illinois. It's a suburb just north of Chicago. We have 78,000 people. It's where Northwestern University is. So, if you think of a kind of progressive, diverse university town, suburb of a big city, that's kind of how Evanston is. It's right along the lakefront of Lake Michigan. So it's unlike other suburbs of the city of Chicago just because of that kind of academic vibe it's got. I got into politics in a kind of baffling and surprising way. I was a mathematics professor at the University of Chicago. Most of my colleagues did not wind up in electoral office, but I...
Smart.
Academia can be brutal as well, so who knows. But they're certainly still confused about what I wound up doing to myself. But, I got there in the fall of 2002. It was a year after the September 11th attacks. It was 6 months before the invasion of Iraq, and it just felt, and it feels quaint to say this now, but it felt then like our country was spinning out of control, that things were dangerous and unmoored from reality, and I just felt like I had to stand up and do something. So eventually spent 8 years in the legislature in Illinois, and now find myself as mayor of Evanston.
Very good. We're going to talk about reparations, and in particular, you and your predecessor, first city in America?
That's right. I think at this time we are the only city that has actually given out reparations as part of a race-based program to repair the harm that we perpetrated to our shame.
And you have a particular focus on housing. Why? How'd you end up there? I know you had a commission or organization take a look at it. And in particular, I also want you to focus on how you're funding it.
Right. So let me back up for a minute, if you don't mind, because there's a lot of context here.
Sure.
Obviously, when people hear the word reparations, their minds naturally go to the question of slavery, which is, obviously a foundational question for this country. We, as a small town in the Midwest, don't feel that we have the capacity or tools to repair the harm done by that fundamental crime in this country's history. But to our shame, we have done plenty on our own, not as being party to chattel slavery, but specifically around the question of housing segregation. And so there was actually a lot of research done locally into the role that the city government itself deliberately and knowingly played in enforcing segregation, segregation in housing, segregation in access to public amenities, and there's plenty that we did. And we have today, still, I would say, a very alarmingly segregated city, and that segregation winds up being felt, among other things, in the context of property value and therefore generational wealth. And so we, unfortunately, as a city, as a corporate body, deliberately and knowingly enacted policies to segregate our community that today still are felt in terms of the massive white-black wealth gap that exists in our
So are we talking about redlining? Are we talking about mortgage discrimination? Are we talking about zoning?
Well, so the city itself wasn't really the main actor behind redlining, but through our zoning code, through our willingness to enforce not only what the federal government and the financial institutions were doing with redlining, but also what local homeowners associations and realtor groups were doing. And then through our allocation of public resources. We were really an important part of that segregation machine. And so we feel that we owe a debt. And because that debt is so closely tied to the role that our housing policies played, we've begun the process of repaying it through a housing program.
And how are you paying for it?
Well, initially, as this was first being discussed, the state legalized the recreational use of cannabis. And because of the role that race has played in the drug war, and because of the, at a minimum in practice, and many would argue in intent, racist components of the way that cannabis laws were enforced, we felt that there's a new revenue stream coming into municipal government, and it's coming in because of a policy change that's trying to reverse this history. And so what better way to put it to use than to fund the reparations program? So the first act the city council took was to commit the first $10 million that will come in through the sales tax on recreational cannabis to the reparations fund. Now, we turn out to be worse drug dealers than we anticipated. And so the rate of receipt of cannabis tax revenue has been very slow. And it's really hampered our ability to do this program at the rate that we think is critical. And so we've recently added another revenue stream, which is a portion of the real estate transfer tax goes into the reparations fund as well.
Okay. So let me understand on the front end of this. So the citizens are not buying cannabis / marijuana at rates that you thought they might, as you anticipated the revenue stream. Is that what we're saying?
It is a college town, after all. Yeah, I mean, the actual sort of under the hood thing here is that just by coincidence, there's a couple dispensaries that are located just across the border, and so we're just in terms of where cannabis gets sold in practice in Illinois, there's just less of it in Evanston and more in our neighbors than you might have guessed.
Right. So, I mean, are you going to take up this theme in your next campaign, that you want people to buy more?
You know, I haven't written any literature yet. I don't have a slogan yet, but nothing is off the table.
You might want to field test that first.
Yeah,
right. Yeah. I know some great polling firms. What's the future of this? And, you know, do you see this, no pun intended, do you see this growing? I mean, will this kind of effort expand in other cities across the country?
The answer to that question is yes. We had in town recently, a week or two ago, a conference of municipal reparations leaders from across the country. There were folks from dozens of municipalities who are all in different stages of this journey. Some are just exploring, some have committed to do something but don't know what yet exactly. Some are preparing to stand up programs. And so I think there's
Were you guys giving out samples at the...
You know, that's really inconsistent with our goal of selling more, so to ensure that we get the revenue that we need.
Okay. I mean, you could have done a discount thing or something, right? Just to,
you know, there should be a conference next year as well, so we'll be ready.
Right. It's an idea you could steal. Tell us about the conference. Larry's regretting having asked me to do this right now. Our time is suddenly going to go to like 2 minutes.
Right, it does seem like it's moving faster than the real world clock does operate. As soon as I said cannabis, I noticed that 10 minutes got just sliced off.
Right.
You know, it's interesting. So Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, who's been really, since the retirement of Representative Conyers, has really been leading this effort in the U.S. House of Representatives. She came and kind of was very clear about the fact that there's significant progress that's being made on the federal level. You know, we've gone in a few short years from this being kind of a fringe issue that was thought to be like maybe 2 centuries from now to, you know, essentially having the support to at least pass the House. But she felt, she was very clear that that support comes from local action. And it was really interesting to hear, you know, there are communities that are experimenting with ways to utilize federal funding to support this kind of initiative. There are communities that are thinking about economic development aspects, education policy, health policy, because each community has a different history and feels a responsibility to repair different harms that they've, in most cases, created.
Yeah. Tell us about the journey. When we were talking in the back, and a little bit of research. So I think technically this effort started under your predecessor?
Not just technically, but in reality, it started under my predecessor.
All right. You're actually funny. You know, in your own.
When you say actually, what is that supposed to?
Well, I mean, there's a little quirkiness to it, but it's fine. Don't worry about it. You're in Philly. You're at Comcast. It's fine. But from your predecessor to you, I mean, how did it work? Were people like, oh my God, this is insane, or was it fairly straightforward?
Well, one thing I do want to say, not only did this start before I took office, and my predecessor certainly was a supporter and deserves credit for it, but there was a particular member of City Council who really sparked this action. I do think it's worth naming her. Her name is Robin Rue Simmons. And the reason I think it's important to credit her is that on this issue, it is so easy to argue forever. Right? Forever. Right? This is a tough issue. You could make it legally overcomplicated, politically overcomplicated, morally overcomplicated, and you can, by virtue of talking yourself to death, never do anything. And what Robin really said was, we can't afford to keep just talking and not acting. And it can be scary to go first, it can be risky to go first, but someone's got to go first, and it's going to be us. And so I think she really did a great service, not only to our community, but to the country, and being willing to push the council to take that plunge. And I think that's important. But when you ask, yeah, clap for Robin. That's good. Yeah. When you ask if people thought, is this crazy? It is really shocking to most people outside of the city when I explain the kind of political climate that exists around this issue. There are certainly people who quietly oppose this in the way that, Republican members of Congress might oppose it. And I occasionally hear from them privately, but in terms of the public discourse in our town, the two factions on this issue are support for what we're doing and opposition for what we're doing because it does not go far enough. And there is actually sometimes a relatively bitter fight between those two factions, but come on man, you guys are crazy, how could you possibly be considering doing this with my tax dollars in the first place faction is not a meaningful part of our political discourse in town.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I could see this going really easily here. As Philadelphians, we really do love change, as long as things can pretty much stay the same. We will embrace these kinds of ideas. And what was that thing you said about you're just going to talk and talk and talk? That thing, yeah. I think
our municipal motto is actually progress without change. So I know something about this.
Have you thought about a Netflix special? Yeah, this is absolutely a kind of a process town. We do love a great debate and argument about things, even when we agree. We still have to have a bit of a scuffle. When you tell us about at the conference, what was mostly smaller cities, medium-sized cities, any big cities come to that conference?
No, it varied all over the map. San Francisco and Detroit were there, and a number of much smaller towns as well, some counties also. This conference was for municipalities, but there's also a new wave of nonprofit institutions, especially universities, that are starting to come to grips with their own histories as well.
Okay. What else is going on in the town? What's next?
How long do you have? Well, I guess 11 minutes and
11 minutes, 35 seconds. now that you asked.
Turned out it was probably a rhetorical question now that I think about it. So actually on December 1st, we stood up our guaranteed income pilot. So we've now selected 150 families who are receiving a $500 monthly cash benefit for a year. We're partnering with the university to do research on that, so we'll have a lot of data.
University of
Northwestern.
Northwestern.
We'll have a lot of data, coming out of the back end of that to figure out.
And how are you paying for that?
That's a partnership between some university funds together with some of our federal rescue funds.
Okay. What else?
So we are not only in the area of reparations, but we're really deeply, deeply engaged in questions of affordable housing. We've got the best thing a community can have, which is people want to live in our town, but they can't afford to. They can't always afford to stay, and they certainly often can't afford to come. So we're looking, back to the question of zoning, we're looking at bold changes in our zoning code and trying to figure out how to create a situation where those who want to afford to be in Evanston can afford to be there.
Now, the money coming out of the fund, and you've talked about the two different funding sources, just to be clear, often when people think about reparations, the assumption is a direct cash payment to the individual. In the Evanston case, that's not the case. It is housing, and so talk about where does the money actually go?
So far, all of the funds that have been allocated are for a housing program.
Right.
So these are for individuals who lived in Evanston during the time that the documented acts of municipal racist conduct occurred and are still living in Evanston. They're eligible for a $25,000 payment toward a down payment on a home, toward principal, toward home improvements, and so forth. But it is, admittedly, and I want to be honest about this, it's relatively narrow because it's in the context of home ownership.
Right.
And we know that that's not going to reach everybody who needs to be reached.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not the case that the full $10 million have been committed to that program. That's the first step. And then we have a reparations committee working out what other steps they're going
Because
to.
you're also looking at other issues. This is
That's
really
exactly
just the
right.
first issue, right? Economic development and a variety of other.
Right, economic development, education. I mean, like a lot of places, we have deep segregation in the history of our school system. And in fact, our school district is just opening a school in the traditionally, historically black neighborhood of town, which has been without a neighborhood school for decades. And so the question that poses is there a way for the city to utilize some of its reparations dollars to really achieve educational equity in town, which we have not historically had.
Yeah. Take a couple questions from the audience.
You bet.
Yeah, it was in my briefing notes somewhere that we could, but even if it wasn't. Oh, Larry.
And get questions.
Good to
And
see
by the way, I have one.
Is that like
which
a Phil Donahue kind of?
Well, Phil Donahue,
thing you're
exactly.
doing? Yeah.
We're aging ourselves.
Yeah.
What is with mayors and socks? I mean, it's great. But
Well, look, if you're going to wear a blue suit virtually every day at work, the least you could do is wear some colorful socks. I mean, just,
There you go.
A little flash.
here's a quick question. Yes, we make it quick. No speeches.
Michael, how would you scale this in Philly?
I'm sorry? How would I?
How would you scale his program in Philadelphia?
How would I scale this program in Philadelphia? Well, I think, as the mayor said, something like this, you really do need a champion. And so I'd be looking for someone's in city council to really help drive the agenda. I think also the commission that they created, I think this is an issue that should not just really kind of come from the mind of the mayor. You really want to get citizen engagement, citizen involvement. Obviously, the mayor has to help drive what's going on as a chief executive, but the voices of the public really need to be heard on something like that. Folks need to understand, again, the controversy. I mean, we wouldn't have just the two factions of, we want it or we want more. We would see, because as my wife literally just said to me this morning, that, Philly is generally the quick road to no. Often no is the response before the idea has even been heard. So this would be controversial, no question about it. Not impossible, but that's what communication is all about, and some cheerleading, and really caring and addressing the issue. I mean, let's acknowledge at least the bad things that have happened, and a whole lot has happened and continues to happen. There was a report just last week that there's discrimination in life insurance.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, black people can't even die properly, right? That, you keep everything equal in terms of, income and a whole host of other factors. And even in life insurance, there's discrimination. And so we have to really kind of come to grips with a lot of these things. But it's certainly worth exploring here in this great town.
Got a question,
Next question.
question all the way up here.
All the way up.
All right.
Who's that with that 76ers jersey on over there? I know.
Probably not me. Mayor Biss, I'm from the North Shore of Chicago, so very close to Evanston, grew up over there. You alluded to a question that was on my mind, which is Northwestern has such a huge presence in the fabric of Evanston. And I was thinking also about, I worked at Columbia University in Morningside Heights and lived just down the hill in Harlem with huge economic disparity, and the university has a huge impact on real estate and housing prices in the area. So I was interested to hear, it sounds like you are engaging the university because they're partially funding this guaranteed income pilot, but two questions that are kind of related, and one is, how do you engage those massive institutions that have such a big impact on the local economy? And secondly, Evanston is very diverse and pretty progressive, but it's surrounded by some other very wealthy suburbs that probably don't share the same agenda. So I'm wondering about, is there a way to engage other communities that are not kind of on the same page and sell the same kinds of programs so that you don't have disparity right next to the border of where you guys are doing something municipally?
I will answer the question, notwithstanding your abandonment of our area. You're welcome back at any time. So the university is a tricky issue, right? Because we're not Philadelphia, right? We're a town of 78,000 people with a large and really kind of financially and culturally gravitational institution. And the relationship's complicated. I think the truth of the matter is we wouldn't be who we are without a thriving university, and they wouldn't be who they are without a thriving city. But there's a lot of zero-sum ways that we bump up against each other that create friction. And so, my predecessor's predecessor came into office in 2009, and at the same time, a new university president came in, and she solved this problem by baking cookies for him and delivering them at the president's mansion, which forced him to return the Tupperware that the cookies were contained in to City Hall. And then somehow the next thing we knew, the university had bought the city a fire truck. And I was actually working on a very similar plan during the campaign, but then my children both became vegan, and I find vegan baking really, really difficult. And so anyway, it's been hard, is the bottom line. But I think if we find areas for partnership, like this guaranteed income program, where not only their money is useful, but the research that they're doing could not be done by anybody else in town and will make the program better and will make the educational opportunities for the grad students doing the research also better, right, where we find these positive sum interactions, that then lubricates the harder conversations. So I'm spending a lot of time looking for those. And yeah, we do have a really different political culture than our neighbors. And I mean that on a local level, right? Our neighbors, nowadays, they still vote for Joe Biden for president and stuff like that, although they maybe didn't when you were living there. But they don't have this kind of activist, progressive vibe. And we find ways to collaborate, but we also sort of do our own thing sometimes. And because there's this divergence in kind of culture, that's reflected in who chooses to live where, and you start to see more and more divergence. And I think that's just a kind of a maybe somewhat troubling feature of life in America these days, that we are more, putting aside for a second questions of race, we're more and more segregated around questions of culture and tone and style, and people encounter differences in those categories less often than I think would be healthy.
There were
gonna
so many ethics violations in that whole cookies fire truck. I'm just trying to sort through that. Wow, what a scandal.
We're gonna do one last quick question.
Thank you. What were some of the objections and reactions from even within Evanston or from the local press about the issue of reparations? Because there's always seemed to be a feeling of not worthy of getting reparations, not deserving.
We are a pretty small town, and 2022 being what it is, we don't have that much of a local press. The local press is not, for the most part, been hostile to this. The biggest challenge we've had really has been from people who believe it doesn't go far enough, and not in a, hey, this is a nice first step, I want to push you to do more on step 2, but rather in a kind of a, we think this is so inadequate that it's insulting to us that you're calling it reparations kind of way. And the mayor alluded to one of the most important aspects of this, which is the question of should it be cash payments exclusively, and does it really count as reparations to do something that's more focused on a particular area of need? And so those conversations have been difficult. As mayor, I've made a point of honoring those who have objections, appointing some of them to the reparations committee to make sure those voices are at the table when we continue to design the next iteration and the next step forward.
That was incredible. I mean, he talked right to the zero. Just right to the zero. I got to give it to you.
And Mayor Kasim Reed, the former mayor of Atlanta, are doing a new podcast called How to Really Run a City. And this, maybe you have been so entertaining and also informative. Maybe this is worth discussing in further depth. The only thing is that on the podcast, no one will see your socks, but we'll figure out a way to describe them. I can't thank you guys enough for your leadership and for your intellect, and Mayor Nutter especially for your leadership in Philadelphia. Thank you both.